You are listening to the e-flux podcast.
My name is Hallie. Thank you for joining us on the e-flux podcast. We're thrilled today to have Shimrit Lee. Shimrit Lee is a writer, educator, and curator based in Philadelphia, an interdisciplinary scholar working at the intersection of visual culture, performance, and critical security studies. Shimrit's research interests relate to the cultural production of security narratives in Israel and the US. She holds a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies from NYU and currently teaches high school history as well as community-based adult education at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. Her book, Decolonize Museums, will be published by Warscapes and OR Books in 2021. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about this morning. I'm super excited. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm thrilled. I thought we could start off a little bit with the overview of the way you've structured your forthcoming book, based around the idea that you borrow from the scholar Wandile Kasibe of the museum as a crime scene. And this idea of a crime scene, of course, entails a perpetrator, victim, a motive, evidence. And I'm just wondering if you could briefly discuss this logic as it pertains to the museum as a site in history, and then we'll just see where we go after that.
Sure. I want to begin by just saying that I'm speaking to you today from the city of Philadelphia, which is on the unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape people, which, like the rest of this country, is a crime scene. It's a site of dispossession and colonial theft. And the museum, as we know it today, is an institution that reflects, or rather serves as a microcosm of this greater crime scene. And if you go to any anthropological or natural history museum in the West today, you'll likely find some amount of cultural heritage that was plundered from the global South, from Africa, Asia, indigenous communities across North America, Australia, and so on. And these are sites that house the memories of colonial atrocities in a very literal way through these looted artifacts, while also upholding a facade of neutrality and objectivity. For example, wall texts usually tell these very authoritative, straightforward narratives of the objects on display without actually reckoning with this violence that extracted those objects in the first place, or even thinking about the violence that continues for Indigenous and Black people. Many museums kind of prefer to seal that violence up in the past. And so I draw upon this metaphor of the museum as a crime scene, as you mentioned, from Dr. Wandile Kasibe, a museum educator and scholar from South Africa. And I found that the way that he used this metaphor was really helpful for me, in the sense that it emphasizes the attention needed to uncover this shadow of coloniality that exists within the museum. And I'll just read a quick quote. He writes, "When a site has been demarcated as a crime scene, it is not an ordinary site. You are entering into a place now where you have to look for clues. You look more closely at the objects. What are those labels saying? Who wrote them? Who took those photographs? What was the context? You're entering as an investigator," end quote. And this is how I approach the book, as an investigator. First of all, in a very literal way, I'm drawing upon the work of others who've come before me, who have long been exposing the museum as a crime scene, whether that's activist and artist groups, as well as decades of scholarship from academics, journalists, historians across many different fields. And in each chapter of the book, I'm trying to uncover a different aspect of the colonial crime scene as it exists within the museum. In the first chapter, I look at the collection. I investigate the political and legal battles surrounding plundered artifacts from former colonies and Indigenous communities across the globe that are now held in Western museums. Then I turn to the gaze, thinking about how museums have served as historical extensions of colonial projects, and thinking about how museums have continued to ignore this history, this violence that forms its foundation. In the third chapter, I look at more recent initiatives in which museums have attempted to address these colonial histories with varying levels of success. And finally, my last chapter, which is called Follow the Money, is pretty self-explanatory. I'm investigating these toxic links between museums and board members or sponsors who are tied to oil companies, weapons manufacturers, private prisons, and so on. And also thinking about the broader consequences of how the rise of neoliberalism has transformed museums into these market-driven private businesses. So in a way, my book is kind of just an attempt at this investigation. There remains a lot of work to be done, but I think of it as an overview of the museum as crime scene.
Sweet. Yeah. I mean, it was such a thrill to read. The title of the book is Decolonize Museums. And of course, decolonization is such a contested buzzword right now, with museums and art institutions having maneuvered around calls to decolonize through like neoliberal sleights of hand, like working with specific communities or hiring new curators, but then refusing to do the actual work of repatriation, restitution, reparations. So I'm wondering if you could tease out a bit how you're conceiving of the verb decolonize within this context. And I know you argue throughout the book that the museum can and must be decolonized. And I'm wondering where you see your line of thinking in comparison to scholars and activists who argue that the museum is inherently colonial and cannot be decolonized, must be abolished. So yeah, if you could just tease out that word a little bit, that'd be great.
I'd say in my own understanding of what it means to decolonize the museum, I'm drawing upon the work of Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Yang, who wrote an influential article called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, in which they warn against the kind of co-optation that you're talking about, in which words like decolonization are superficially absorbed into the language of institutions. For example, the statement that I began our conversation with, the land acknowledgement, is often now being used by museums, and many Native scholars have kind of suspicion around that or reluctance to accept that as a win when these institutions are less willing to actually unsettle the status quo, or when there are stolen artifacts on display in their exhibitions. We have to ask, what does this actually mean? What does this work look like? And similarly, when museums hire more diverse curators or staff, that's clearly a positive step in the right direction, but these initiatives may be more appropriately understood in a social justice framework rather than one of decolonization. Decolonization requires a material repatriation of both stolen artifacts and of land and resources back to colonized people. And this is the framework for decolonization that I take throughout the book, one that sees the museum as intertwined with society. And therefore, any discussion on decolonizing museums must take into account the urgent need for reparations and must understand capitalism as a driving force of inequality, both within the realm of the arts and the museum and within society at large. Throughout the book, I recognize the important work done by museums when it comes to things like hiring more diverse curators or mounting exhibits that decenter Eurocentric viewpoints, basically reflecting the voices of the people within their collections and within their audiences. But I also continuously highlight that such changes are meaningless without real material sacrifices. And you mentioned abolition, which I think is an interesting parallel project to decolonization. But it also depends on what you mean when you use that word abolition, because like decolonization, it can mean many different things to different people. And to me, abolishing museum means abolishing its current formation. I look towards movements like Strike MoMA that are trying to reimagine alternative models for the museums. So rather than relying on these predatory museum board structures, museums should be directly accountable to the public through things like land back initiatives or cooperative structures. But I think abolishing the museum opens up a whole realm of creative possibilities that we can really use to rethink the function of museums. For example, we can ask, can the museum be opened up for housing and shelter? Can we create a system in which artwork circulates in and out of the museum, maybe going to people's homes or community centers? Can the museum be more of an open air display or a traveling exhibition rather than keeping everything in a singular building, generally located in an urban capital for which people have to pay an entry fee? Laura Rakovich discusses libraries as an example of what a truly plural museum could look like. A building that's free to enter, that's easily accessible, and so on. And I think we can look towards smaller community-based museums as an example of this kind of reconceptualization. In my book, I write about tribal museums in New Mexico and Michigan that are entirely community-led, as well as rural museums in Zimbabwe that incorporate community development as a key component of their work. I think the question is, how can this kind of transformation happen in more mainstream, larger organizations and institutions, particularly those with colonial roots? And for me, abolition isn't about canceling. It's not about moving backwards. It's not about throwing away people's connection with art or with history. It's about creation, about transformation. I was really inspired by Strike MoMA's framework and terms for struggle, in which they write, quote, "Why strike MoMA? So that something else can emerge, something under the control of workers, communities, and artists rather than billionaires," end quote. And to that, I would add an emergence of new ways to think about ownership and stewardship. All of that to say that I think the museum in its current form should absolutely be abolished so that new decolonial frameworks can emerge. These are related projects for me.
Absolutely. I think abolition is a very inherently generative process. I want to go back to the crime scene metaphor for a minute, because within a crime scene, there's also this looming specter of punishment, which is, of course, present, though perhaps not necessarily overt in the museum. And you talk a lot about this in the beginning half of your book, the notion of the exhibitionary complex, as termed by sociologist Tony Bennett. Could you discuss a bit of the ways in which the early museum served not only to discipline and order society, but also to alter society by transforming museum goers into observers of reality instead of participants in it?
So in one chapter of the book, I trace the history of the museum alongside other institutions of showing and telling that were used to generate consent to existing political orders, specifically imperialism. For example, there were early cabinets of curiosities. These were private collections created by elites, composed of rare or fantastical natural objects designed to provoke intrigue and also tell a story about the wonders of colonial exploration. There was also the World's Fair, which used spectacle and exhibition to bolster these ideas of Eurocentrism. As you noted, these sites are what Tony Bennett calls the exhibitionary complex, sites that served educational purposes through their display of knowledge in very carefully curated ways. And they served a regulatory function as well. For example, the architectural design of museums and World's Fairs were set up in a way that made the crowd visible to itself. So visitors could watch other visitors. And according to Bennett, who is drawing a lot here off of Foucault's conception of prisons, these types of spaces, the museum, the World's Fair, crafted the modern citizen by disciplining them and molding them with certain attitudes, opinions, behaviors, norms, all of which contributed to this consensus for imperialism and the imperial project. I also draw upon what Timothy Mitchell described as the world of exhibition, in which he traces this phenomenon in which Europeans in the 19th century began to view themselves as separate from the physical world, therefore allowing them to observe it and control it. For example, there was this obsession with painting landscapes from afar. So painters would try to find the best spot on the hill apart from the urban center. They wanted to become this observing eye apart from the world. And this phenomenon bled into all levels of society. And I argue that the same kind of mental detachment is still very much present in museums today, particularly when it comes to ethnographic or anthropological museums. So, for example, you can imagine the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Think about the dioramas in the Hall of Asian and African People, where you have these frozen panoramas of non-European people in these landscapes behind glass. And you can just think of the thousands of school children passing through the museum on field trips or through summer camp excursions, at least before COVID. And these displays really give the impression that these cultures no longer exist, or they exist in a different historical time period. And there's no possibility of a shared humanity or connection between visitors and the people whose cultures are on display. So there are real consequences to this kind of exhibitionary complex that we see today.
Sweet, yeah, absolutely. And I want to follow the course of your book a bit throughout the history of the museum as an institution, because next you write about the new museology that surged forth in the year like 2000 or so. And this was when like museums came to understand themselves as contact zones, where visitors played a more active role and where curation turned from conservation of objects to conceptual frameworks. Could you discuss a bit about the successes and the pitfalls of these two categories of museum projects that arose at this moment? You label them as the multivocal exhibit and the community-based exhibit.
Sure. The concept of new museology, I guess it's not so new anymore, was a call for museums to take on a more active role in the communities that they were meant to serve, whether through education, social activism, establishing greater connections with their audiences. And rather than this kind of top-down instrument of social control, rather than this exhibitionary complex, the museum was reimagined as a space for cross-cultural exchange, where visitors could take a more active role as interpreters, rather than being these passive sponges awaiting the intake of information. There was also more of an interest in collaborative projects with Indigenous people. And this new museology, there were different waves. It kind of arose in the 80s, and then there was another wave in the 90s, and then the early 2000s. And Ruth Phillips, who is a Canadian art historian, usefully grouped these kinds of collaborations of new museology into two categories: community-based and multivocal. In community-based exhibits, the museum professional takes on the role of facilitator, and the community, often the Indigenous communities, they take on more significant role as decision makers. And this is something that Native American communities have long been advocating for decades. And I'd say that the National Museum of the American Indian has really been the most visible manifestation of this type of model. They've really prided themselves on including Indigenous groups in every aspect of curatorial decision making. But of course, there are downfalls or pitfalls to how this has really played out on the ground. Amy Lonetree, a scholar of Indigenous history and museum studies, has really written extensively about the case of the National Museum of the American Indian, both in terms of its incredible revolutionary potential, but also its downfalls. For example, by centering Indigenous ways of knowing and presenting information, she argues that a lot of times, at least the early exhibitions, were a bit convoluted. It was hard for the audiences to truly grasp the violence that was inflicted on Native American communities. And the second model, multivocal exhibits, allow for multiple perspectives in an exhibition. So the voices of curators, scholars, Indigenous people are all present within the gallery, offering up their perspectives on the content on display. And there's often a degree of reflexivity or irony or meta presentation that encourages visitors to reflect on their own position or experiences in relation to whatever is on display. But there are also challenges here. There are cases in which audiences completely miss the multivocal message that the curator is attempting to convey. It's important to keep in mind that visitors bring their own cultural baggage to an exhibition. And if an exhibition is trying to be too clever or ironic, then visitors might just walk away confused, or even worse, they just might walk away with their own prejudices intact. This critical reading might not come across. And one of the most well-known examples of a successful multivocal exhibition is Fred Wilson's 1992 exhibition, Mining the Museum, which was organized by the Maryland Historical Society. And as a Black artist, Wilson was invited to go into the museum archives and sift around the collections and rearrange the space from his own point of view. So, for example, he placed these ornate silver jugs in a display case next to iron slave shackles as a way to link this grand display of wealth that we see throughout historical museums to its production through enslavement and subjugation. And there was this additional layer of irony here in how he used glass cabinets, these neat labels, select lighting, all of these things that we recognize as methods of museum display. He really wanted audiences to think about how they move through these spaces where knowledge is constructed and made to seem natural or neutral. And he was very overt in this irony through captioning and brochures. So visitors were able to walk away with this critical message that he was intending to articulate. So these practices of community-based or multivocal exhibitions can make the museum a more democratic, participatory, critical space when done correctly and with the input of diverse audiences.
And so to continue on in this chronology of the museum as you delineate in your book, I want to turn now to the contemporary protests within museums and in response to certain shows or trustees or political affiliations that museums have. I know there are tons of examples of this that will no doubt come to mind. But I want to start off with your discussion in the book of the debate surrounding Dana Schutz's controversial painting. And this was at the 2017 Whitney Biennial. It was a painting of Emmett Till by a white artist. And you note that protests by artists like Hannah Black and Parker Bright, quote, this is your quote, added a crucial layer of multivocality to the gallery. end quote, and spurned the Whitney to host a public conversation on the matter. I'm wondering if you might be able to speak a bit to this phenomenon of protests sort of being recuperated by museums to bolster the institution's own reputation. Because I'm thinking also, of course, at the Whitney, there are plenty of moments in their history. For example, even right after the 2017 biennial, their show, An Incomplete History of Protest, featured a gallery dedicated to letters of protest sent to the Whitney, detailing grievances that artists and activists had with the institution. In many ways, this feels sort of like the recontextualization process that looted objects underwent during the colonial period. That was a lot, but could you speak a bit to the history of museums collecting moments of political protest and then repurposing them to boost the institution's own reputation?
It's a really interesting connection that you're making here between the process of forgetting and subsequent recontextualization that takes place when looted objects are absorbed into the collection of the museum, and the processes by which museums have absorbed political protest without actually taking the steps necessary to alleviate or even respond to the very source of such protests. And I think the example of Dana Schutz's painting controversy is really interesting here. In her book, Whitewalling, the scholar Arun D'Souza does a really great job detailing this controversy surrounding the painting, and specifically this subsequent event that the Whitney hosted in an attempt to stage the museum as a platform for public discourse. The director of the museum, Adam Weinberg, has famously characterized the Whitney as a safe space for unsafe ideas. But during the event, the Whitney didn't actually acknowledge their institutional complicity with this controversy and with anti-Blackness on a structural level. To go back to my original point, they really focused on this social justice framework of diversity and inclusion rather than digging into these more unsettling or uncomfortable issues that were happening on a much broader level. And I think the museum's intervention into this controversy was less significant and impactful than that of artist Parker Bright, who launched a silent protest by standing in front of Schutz's painting with the words "Black Death Spectacle" written across the back of his t-shirt. And I write in the book, I kind of categorize this as a multifocal intervention because this performance added an extra layer of meaning or interpretation to the entire gallery that was then multiplied through social media because images of this protest went viral and spurred even more conversation online. However, I think this kind of reflexivity on behalf of museum is really interesting to interrogate. On the one hand, I think it's important. It's important that museums are willing to show that they know that they aren't neutral spaces and they never have been. However, I don't think it's nearly enough. And I think that COVID has really exposed this facade of the museum as a progressive or politically woke space. It's hard to talk about being a safe space for unsafe ideas when you're literally laying off or furloughing your staffers while the higher ups continue to live in luxury. And this brings me back again to that idea, that tension between social justice frameworks in which the museum can kind of slap on a Band-Aid of when it comes to issues of diversity and representation versus a decolonial framework that requires the museum to really face its own structural problems.
I want to elaborate a bit on this idea of decontextualization and recontextualization of looted goods, and see if we can sort of extrapolate that process as it might apply to other aspects of the contemporary museum. For context, I know in your book you discuss the precise decontextualization process for stolen objects, and you focus specifically on an example from Ariella Aisha Azule's recent book, Potential History. And that's the example of the sculpture that the Pinde people of the Congo made to commemorate a revolt against Belgian colonial rule in 1931. And then in the 1970s, members of the Pinde community sold the statue to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. And you write, I'll quote you here, in the catalog accompanying the sculpture's display in the museum, curator Richard Woodward points out that the statue could be sold out of the community because the Pinde do not believe that their objects should last forever. For this reason, too, they avoid making statues out of permanent materials. So what happens when this statue, created to be deliberately ephemeral and inaccessible, enters a Western museum where it is conserved and displayed as a piece of fine art? And you continue. First, there's the process of forgetting. The Pinde statue becomes a unique art object when the museum erases its pre-imperial function as well as the story of its violent acquisition. Second, there is an element of disrespect at work when curatorial or scholarly experts scrutinize communal codes, values, and practices that are not meant for outside audiences. Finally, a process of aestheticization repositions the statue as art and allows it to be both decontextualized and commodified, end quote. So if we can assume that museums are their own type of monuments in a way, and that monuments are contested in that they need to be contextualized or removed, etc., how might the museum undergo a sort of decontextualization process that could reverse its foundations in colonial enterprise? And I think also, let me elaborate a little bit more, because I'm thinking of this question in the context of museums within formerly colonized nations. And I'll just quote a bit more of your writing to flesh out this question and just to give a grander intro into your book and your writing style. But so in the passage, the same chapter of the discussion of the Pinde sculpture, you write, while discussing repatriation, quote, depriving African youth of their artistic and cultural heritage, for example, means prolonging the trauma of colonialism. As long as the cultural resources inherited from Africa's past are stored in institutions outside of the continent, African youth will remain unaware of the richness and creativity of their past. Alongside legal and national rights, a moral right emerges, the right to one's inheritance, and a right to admire the ingenuity and creativity of those who came before, end quote. And then a little bit later, quote, we must heed Azule's call to remember the pre-imperial moment in which such objects existed and found meaning. These objects were cared for long before Europeans deemed non-Western communities incapable of preserving them. Those communities could and should preserve them once more, end quote. So I suppose my question is, can the museum undergo the same sort of complete decontextualization process of a looted good so that the practice of collecting and displaying and accumulating wealth and the social codes of discipline that the museum engenders no longer have these same foundations and effects as in the Western or colonial museum? Like, in other words, how might the museum exist in formerly colonized nations without replicating a sort of colonial gaze or becoming a symbol of class distinction, et cetera, et cetera?
So I'm hearing two questions here. I think in regards to your first question, how might the museum think through a decontextualization process, particularly thinking about that really interesting parallel that you make between the monument and the museum? We're having this conversation at a time in which monuments to historical oppression are being torn down or defaced across the globe, particularly in the wake of the murder of George Floyd in 2020 at the hands of Minneapolis police officers. And I think in many ways, these acts can really teach us something about museums and their futures, because museums are like monuments. There's a certain assumption within them that they should be permanent, that history can somehow be frozen within its walls, and almost fetishizing of ideas of conservation or preservation. And likewise, there's this assumption of consent when it comes to the presence of monuments in public spaces, even if those monuments are incredibly insulting or bring up historical trauma. And so the museum has also historically adopted this assumption of neutrality. So I think when it comes to both monuments and museums, these questions take on urgency. And when we think of whether or how the museum can undergo a decontextualization process, we can kind of take lessons from this parallel movement around monuments. First of all, by letting go of this neutrality assumption. And in the past, many scholars and activists and artists have been very active in calling out this myth of museum neutrality. Notably, Latanya Otri, who has launched a global advocacy initiative with the hashtag museums are not neutral to inspire people to speak to issues of racism within exhibits or issues working in the museum industry, or broadly calling out how white supremacy is able to function under the guise of objectivity or apolitical institutions, which is a myth. So first of all, we need to let go of that myth. And secondly, the museum, like the monument, needs to let go of this permanence fetish. They need to be willing to return this stockpile of artifacts and artwork and even human remains that were looted from former colonies and indigenous communities across the globe, and really rethink the meaning of stewardship, of curation, of ownership that have been historically rooted in capitalist logic or conservationism, which itself has historical ties to colonial science and ideology, and instead really center the voices and perspectives of those that have formerly been silenced through colonial projects. In regards to your second question about the issues faced by formerly colonized nations as they erect their own museums or attempt to correct the colonial origins of current museums. In my book, I focus on museums on the African continent. And if you look at the histories of these ethnographic or anthropological museums, you'll likely find a colonial origin story. Most of these museums were set up by elite white scholars, these history buffs, ethnographers who came to these countries to document the flora and the fauna and the human cultures of the continent, basically as a way to generate scholarship in the service of imperialism. This is true as well in Iraq, where you have Gertrude Bell, the director of antiquities for the British. She devoted herself to setting up the National Museum of Iraq and basically gave herself the authority to decide which of Iraq's artifacts would stay in the country and which ones would be exported out of the country by Western archaeologists. And there was always an opposition to this kind of colonial museology. For example, in Iraq, early Arab nationalists really rallied around archaeology as a component of nationalism and national identity. And we see how these battles are still being played out, especially because many of these museums are still haunted by their colonial origins. For example, the National Museum of Kenya, in the first 2 decades of its existence, post-independence, its exhibitions remained largely unchanged. So you had these kind of old school colonial ethnographic displays presenting this encyclopedic reading of Kenya's ethnic groups. But in the last couple of decades, there's really been a push to use this museum as a national symbol to inject more nationalist narratives into the exhibition. For example, artifacts related to anti-colonial struggles, or more contemporary displays that celebrate Kenyan food, sports, language, so on. And these exhibits were created in collaboration with the public through workshops, surveys, radio call-in shows, and so on. But then on the other side of that, you have museums that seem to be frozen in time completely. In Zimbabwe, for example, there are still museums that glorify Rhodesian colonial forces and even refer to anti-colonial resistance fighters as terrorists. And interestingly, actually, the Rhodes Museum, which is one of these contentious museums, was recently burned to the ground in an alleged arson attack. So we could say that's maybe one way to get rid of that colonial foundation, just burn it down to the ground and start over. But a third route is perhaps to erect new museums, which is also happening in the formerly colonized world. Senegal, for example, recently opened the Museum of Black Civilization to demonstrate the cultural heritage of Africans, not just in Africa, but in diaspora communities all over the world. And this is a huge undertaking. I believe there's 18,000 gallery rooms, humidity controlled. There's also empty rooms that are awaiting repatriated objects. There's an understanding that this museum is incomplete without this cultural heritage that they are demanding back, mostly from France. And so the stakes are very high. And as you mentioned, there's a focus on this idea that African youth really have a right to feel that connection with their cultural heritage. And the question is, can this happen without the shadow of the colonial legacy that looms over many of these museums? And so there are many paths to kind of dealing with or undoing that colonial museology. And all of those paths take time and resources. But I'd say at the very least, it means removing harmful Eurocentric displays that perpetuate colonial narratives or trauma, that kind of toppling of monuments type of framework. It means returning stolen artifacts into these empty galleries. And it means exhibitions that actually speak to post-colonial realities and that actually serve the desires and the interests of the public.
And I want to also dig a bit deeper into these new institutions that are cropping up especially as you note, in West Africa. And I'm going to quote you again. So you write, quote, "In the decades following independence, many West African governments began restoring historical sites associated with the slave trade in an attempt to generate revenue through tourism. These initiatives were boosted by an explosion of, quote, heritage trips to West Africa in 1976. International institutions have poured money into diaspora-focused tourist initiatives in Africa. UNESCO's Slave Route Project, for example, promotes cultural tourism through the preservation and restoration of West Africa's numerous slave castles. In the 1990s, the Smithsonian, in conjunction with the United Nations Development Program and the United States Agency for International Development, invested $10 million in the development of exhibitions in Ghana's historic forts. Slave trade memorializations aren't the only sites on the continent that rely heavily on international investment. Senegal's Museum of Black Civilization, first proposed in 1966 by the country's first president, Leopold Sédar Senghor, could only be inaugurated after a $34 million investment from China, end quote. So can you talk a bit about the political dynamics behind these international and foreign investments that fuel these large-scale museum projects in formerly colonized countries?
There's no doubt that these museums and monuments that commemorate the slave trade are incredibly significant, particularly for African-American travelers searching for that connection with an ancestral homeland. Recently, I watched the Netflix docuseries High on the Hog, in which food writer Stephen Satterfield travels to Benin to explore how enslaved Africans carried their culinary knowledge from the African continent to a new land, to the US. And at the end of the first episode, he visits the Door of No Return in the city of Ouidah in Benin, which is a memorial to the more than 1 million Africans taken from their homeland. And the weight of that experience for him is so tremendously emotional. And it's clear that these sites are crucial historical monuments, especially for Black Americans who travel across the Atlantic in search of those ancestral connections that were displaced or severed through the slave trade. In my research, however, I did find some criticism of these sites coming from African writers and critics. For example, people were saying that West African states like Ghana are really heavily investing in these sites rather than other museums like ethnographic and anthropological museums that desperately need upgrades, that desperately need to be more in line with the post-colonial nation. Others say that these sites are kind of being used to profit off of African bodies to generate revenue. And then there's a separate issue that you raised, which is that many museums on the African continent are financed either by international corporations or a handful of wealthy individuals, or in the case of Senegal's Museum of Black Civilization, foreign governments, in that case, China specifically. And this is just one example of how China is wielding soft power on the continent as a whole. And as I mentioned earlier, the Museum of Black Civilization is an extremely powerful symbol of African post-colonial cultural production. And yet the fact that China is funding this project is a little bit awkward, as it points to a new kind of neo-colonial dynamic that is emerging, and the persistence of unequal systems of global economic governance that keeps many African nations in a state of economic dependency. So when we talk about the kind of economic self-sufficiency that is crucial to a truly decolonized institution, we of course have to bring it back to a conversation around reparations. And this is actually where I began this answer, which is thinking about the door of no return. These doors exist in Benin and across West Africa, where the transatlantic slave trade attempted to empty the continent of human life, manpower, income, creativity, innovation, and entire generations. And so reparations is a necessary step in confronting this massive psychological and material scar and helping African cultural institutions achieve that sort of economic independence from foreign funding.
So I have a follow-up question about repatriation and the status of repatriation as it relates to museums and upholding the concept of the nation and building nationalisms. You note in the book that a very common argument against repatriation is this concept of the universal or cosmopolitan museum, in which art objects and objects of cultural heritage should belong to the world and should be housed in, quote, museums of the world. And that's a phrase that previous and current British museum directors have used to justify their holdings of looted goods. And then in a different logic that justifies this universalism, you note that scholar Kwame Anthony Appiah argues that repatriation upholds nationalism, citing that much of what is considered cultural patrimony was made by societies that no longer exist, and that nations should drop repatriation charges because objects held in Western museums should instead serve as agents of cross-cultural understanding. I'm wondering if you might speak to where we could find a middle ground within the repatriation discourse so that claims on cultural patrimony are respected and followed through on, but in a way that doesn't necessarily bolster concepts of nationalisms or build toxic nationalisms. Perhaps also you might be able to discuss here the ways in which museums are employ the strategy of nation branding. And you write about this at length, particularly in regards to settler colonial states like Israel. So yeah, I think that's my last question, and then we'll close out from there.
This question brings up another bigger question regarding the role of nationalism in decolonization more broadly. If we look historically, nationalism was a natural response to the violence and dispossession of colonialism. Countries throughout the global South sought recognition as national entities. They wanted a place at the table. They wanted to regain their sovereignty, their resources, their sense of identity. And since we exist in a world of nation states, nationalism was a tool, a rallying cry to achieve that recognition. But even Frantz Fanon, who is kind of seen as the father of decolonial thinking, clarified that national consciousness should just be one step on the road to decolonization. It shouldn't be an endpoint, specifically because it often entails leadership by a small elite at the top. Instead, anti-colonial struggles should ultimately result in an independence that centers the people, the collective, as a political force, and results in an international consciousness of anti-colonial solidarity. And I think this is a useful framework to apply to questions of repatriation. I think it's impossible to just skip over nationalism or national claims when it comes to the return of looted artifacts from formerly colonized nations, and instead just go to this kind of kumbaya discourse of universalism or cosmopolitanism that people like Kwame Anthony Appiah and others have advocated for. I think doing so ignores the sin of colonial theft, first of all, that original sin. And when it comes to settler colonial societies in particular, it ignores ongoing struggles by Indigenous people for political sovereignty and recognition, in which repatriation plays an important role. And sure, I think Appiah may be correct to acknowledge that many post-colonial nations are making repatriation claims to objects created by societies that no longer exist. But the fact of the matter is that we are living in a system of nation states that defines our current international political structure. And if it's not descendants of individuals making those repatriation claims, as is sometimes the case in Holocaust repatriation, for example, then it's going to be whichever nation state can make that claim to cultural patrimony. And when it comes to a middle ground, I think there is a way to ensure that such objects may be seen and studied and appreciated by scholars and by people all over the globe, perhaps through traveling exhibits or online repositories or archives. However, I don't think that discomfort around concepts of nationalism is enough to shut down repatriation claims. And you mentioned the concept of nation branding, which I focus a lot on in my final chapter of the book. Nation branding is when a government kind of renders national identity as a marketable product or uses their culture as a currency. And oftentimes these types of cultural marketing campaigns are used as a facade to gloss over human rights abuses. This is particularly true in Israel. In 2005, the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs launched a Brand Israel PR initiative to shift the image of the country abroad and show Israel's prettier face. Those are literally the words that he used. But artists are increasingly rejecting this kind of project, choosing to boycott projects, exhibitions, opportunities that are funded or aligned with official Israeli state agencies. And doing so kind of reveals the emptiness or the deception that is at the heart of nation branding projects that don't actually recognize, or rather gloss over, ongoing violence and dispossession of Palestinian land and resources by the Israeli state. The other obvious example of nation branding, of course, is taking place in the Gulf region through projects like the Louvre and the Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi. I believe the Guggenheim hasn't been constructed yet. It hasn't been finished, but both of these projects involve the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi pouring millions of dollars into these grand projects created by architects, creating this facade of cosmopolitan cultural powerhouses, and meanwhile hiding the inhumane treatment of migrant workers from Southeast Asia who are building these sites. And again, artists are responding in a variety of ways through dramatic protest interventions, through direct negotiations with the museum, and through boycotts in which they're pledging to withhold their artwork from these new institutions. And finally, I'll just note, in my book, I write about the Palestinian Museum, which was recently constructed in the West Bank town of Bir Zayt, as an example of a post-colonial museum, quote unquote, that perhaps avoids these pitfalls of nation branding or toxic nationalism. Of course, there are many pitfalls and challenges when it came to this project. Due to Israeli restrictions, the museum could not be located in Jerusalem, which is the symbolic capital of Palestine. Much of Palestinian cultural heritage and archival material has been looted or transferred to Israeli collections or museums abroad, making them inaccessible. And actually, the museum itself opened as a big empty space due to a number of management issues. But many are pointing out that this museum is perhaps an opportunity to not create a museum that is so hyper-focused on state building and national identity, or being tied to a project of a particular party ideology, and instead can be a space where diasporic identity, Palestinian identity at large, can be celebrated and explored without being necessarily tied to a nation state. So perhaps I can end there with this hope that museums can perhaps take a lesson from this and think creatively about what sovereignty within a decolonial framework can look like creatively.
Amazing. What a beautiful point to end. And I just want to thank you again. This has been such an elucidating conversation. And it was such a pleasure to read your book, Decolonize Museums, which is coming out shortly, I understand. And thank you so much for being here. And thank you.
Thank you so much for having me and for your thoughtful questions. I really enjoyed our conversation.